Good morning. As Lawrence mentioned, we are running a tad bit behind schedule, but we will press on. And I just told Eric I would much rather Lawrence talk for an extra 2 to 3 minutes than me talk for an extra 2 to 3 minutes. So I think everyone would agree with me there. So I don't think anyone's too upset by that. If you would, we're going to begin with a word of prayer. So if you would, please bow with me. Father in heaven, Lord, we come before you now humbled at the opportunity to meet together as this family on a day like today, especially as we have so many from the community joining us, as we all come together, unity of mind and of faith and of love, to worship you for who you are, to remember your Son and his sacrifice, and to remember that he rose again, giving us such an incredible example of your power and how what you hold in your hand, whether it is your plan for us or the creation of the world, whatever it may be, is just so far more than we could ever understand. And we thank you for that. Thank you for the daily reminders that help us realize that we are the creature and that you are the creator. And help us to regularly remember that we are here so that we can strive to be the best children of yours that we can be. Lord, I ask that you be with us throughout this Bible study. Help it to be beneficial. Help everyone here to strive to learn more about you so that we can continue to please you with every step throughout our day. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Well, again, welcome. I know we have a few more visitors than maybe we normally do. And to add to the slightly different than usual, we have come to one of our flex classes, I think we're calling them, which essentially is dealer's choice for teachers. We just get to talk about what we want to talk about, which is a very terrifying thing. It's a little daunting, to be quite honest with you. I'm a big structure guy. I really like when they just tell me what to do and I just salute and obey and say, yes, sir, Sterling, and go on with my life. Can't win them all, though. So Jared was kind enough to take my lesson from Wednesday and hand this to me. So Jared, thank you for that as well. But in moments like this, I just struggle to be like, what's the perfect thing, right? We've been going through the book of Mark, if you're new or visiting, throughout the last few months, I think at this point. We have just gotten to the point where Jesus has made his triumphal entry and is starting to proclaim in his last days. So we are really at such a heavy point within that gospel, but we've just been living in this book. And so for me, I struggled to be like, what in Mark have we not talked about already? What do I think we need to hit again? And I struggled. I did. And so I kind of reverted back to, well, what else am I looking at this week? Maybe that'll have something kind of make a little light bulb go off. And more than likely you're aware, today being Easter, that the world at large, for the last few days, some dating back to Ash Wednesday a while ago, have been looking forward to this day to remember the resurrection of Christ. And so in my reading outside of this class, which I do sometimes because you can only read Mark so many times, I've been reading through the gospel accounts of the resurrection and what happens after. And Mark, as we've discussed many, many times, is very peculiar in what he includes, what he doesn't include. And there's a story in the book of John that had really kind of hit home to me when it came to kind of connecting dots to Mark. And that was the story of Thomas and Thomas's interaction after Jesus had risen. And for those that know the story, what is Thomas known for? We have a whole song about it, right? What is Thomas known for? Doubting. You throw it on the beginning of his name at this point. Doubting Thomas. And why is that? What was Thomas's doubtful claim to fame in the other Gospels. Yeah, so at that point, others had seen him. The other disciples had seen him, and they've come to Thomas, and they've claimed and proclaimed to him and testified to him what they have seen, and his response is what, essentially? I need to see it, right? I need to see it. And in my normal Bible brain, I really compartmentalize certain people with certain stories and kind of forget that they exist anywhere else. So when I think of Thomas, I think of that story. But through Mark, where have we seen Thomas? And it's far less flashy, but he's there. Where have we seen Thomas in the book of Mark? And thinking about, I guess, his role or his title might give you a little bit of insight there. Who was Thomas? He was one of the 12. You see his name when the 12 are named, and you see it again when they're discussed. And so you start to think, this isn't just some guy who struggled to believe in this thing until he witnessed it himself. And if you just look in the book of Mark, because again, I want that to be the core of where we're at, in just the last few chapters, this is what Thomas himself has heard. Starting in Mark 8, we have the first instance of Jesus foretelling of his death and resurrection. It says, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Next chapter, Mark 9, starting in 30. They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he didn't want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. Repetitive for sure. We're still not done. Mark 10, starting in 32. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen, saying, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes. And they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise. So piecing this all together, was Thomas aware of what was to come? I'm seeing some head shakes. Absolutely. Jesus made it abundantly clear, maybe not giving him every little piece of the puzzle, but he was giving them a picture of what was to come. But when you jump back to John chapter 20 in the story of Thomas, when Thomas doubts, what is Jesus' response to Thomas? Say that one more time, I'm sorry. No, you're good, I'm just moving up. Yeah, so Jesus makes the point not just for him in that specific instance, but also talking to, I would say, us and many others, right? The great faith of those who have not seen yet still believe. But what could Jesus have done, right? Think of what Jesus could have done to the one disciple, seemingly, who still wasn't willing to take the other disciples' word for it, right? The plan had been laid out. He's been told when the resurrection will happen. And Thomas has this doubt. I think it's really telling that Jesus doesn't appear and kind of just bashes Thomas for his unbelief. There is still some level of compassion to where he says, see, right? See and know that I'm telling the truth. Let my body, let this evidence, this knowledge testify to what I've said this whole time. And as I thought through this story, and we often play the game of, if we were there, we would have believed, right? If we would have seen the miracles, there's no way we wouldn't have been following Jesus. And yeah, Brett.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to really have these negative feelings towards Thomas, but I put myself in his position, and as someone who works in research, I like to see the evidence before I advocate for any product that I'm trying to give to the consultants. But, so I think of myself as, if I was in that time, I would probably be more inclined to be more like Thomas and say, I need to see it believe.
Yeah.
And so it's hard for me to really condemn him in this. But, and it's good to see, it's nice to see that compassion coming through with Jesus and knowing that we still have that.
Yeah, to Brett's point, I think we, whether it's our profession or not, are so programmed to need every answer to have faith. We need to know to believe. That's kind of the order of operations. I know it is for me in a lot of ways. And so as I was thinking through maybe my own programming and that relationship of knowing and faith, the book of Mark started kind of just beating me upside the head as I thought through the stories we've talked about up to this point. Because the book of Mark, in my opinion, completely flips that logic on its head. The book of Mark, throughout the entire gospel, we are given several stories of people exhibiting remarkable faith who oftentimes have no real, full understanding of who he is, what he came to accomplish, and at times even how his power worked. And on the flip side, we also see several instances of people who have as much knowledge as you could attain in that day, yet still there wasn't the faith to support it. And as you look through the examples in Mark, I think you can start to pick up maybe what Mark was wanting his readers back then to realize. And that's going to be our goal today. To think through these stories from Mark and say, maybe we're programmed this way. What if we look at it maybe a little different? And if Mark wanted to frame it this way, why is that? So we're going to be going through, in less time than usual, pretty quickly here, some questions about this thing. And these are just some questions I want you to think of. We're not going to, address these right now. Just have these in the back of your mind as we go through these stories. What is the relationship between faith and knowledge in this book? How do these things intersect with one another? How do they build upon each other? Can faith exist without complete knowledge? Do you have to know everything to have this faith? And can you have complete faith without knowing anything? What is this relationship? And then finally, again, what's Mark's point? We've talked about so many themes through this book, but what is Mark's point in how he presents this? So let's start by looking at some of the instances of remarkable faith. And I know this is not like a shouted out type of group, but I think we can do it for one day on short notice. Let's talk about the very first instant of the disciples. What remarkable faith do we see from the disciples? You're welcome. In the very beginning of Mark. What do the disciples do? They follow him. I can always count on you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, what he calls them, they realize who he is, and what is the immediate reaction? They drop everything, and who do they leave behind? Family. So we're leaving behind family, we're leaving behind profession, and we're following him. And so you see it's full sacrifice, full surrender to the discipleship, the following of this Jesus. And thinking back to chapter 1, at this point, and looking through the rest of the book, did the disciples fully get it? No, far from it, especially in chapter 1. And it doesn't get much better at times. But that is what we see off the rip. That is the faith that's being professed. We go to the leper, literally in the same exact chapter. What great faith does the leper show in approaching Jesus. What was leprosy then? Well, you can't really be around others, for sure. Think in terms of like what their life looked like. What was leprosy essentially? Social death. Yeah, it is a death sentence to the world you once knew. And up until that point, we can go through a lot of fun old laws. Was leprosy something that they expected to be healed from the doctor? No, this was it. You were a changed person. This was your new reality. So the fact that this leper, who knows what knowledge he has of Jesus the Christ, let alone the old law, is coming to this person and saying, if you will, you can make me clean. We see another instance of incredible faith, maybe without having the whole picture. Think about the paralytic being lowered down by his 4 friends. Do you think he knew everything there was to know about this man he was being lowered down to see? It sure doesn't seem to me that way. And especially if you look through how the ministry had gone up to this point, right? What was one of the common things Jesus would say to someone after performing a miracle? What was his kind of like follow-up command? Don't tell anyone, right? We've talked so much about this clear plan he had in place of how he wanted to unveil the mystery to them. So I feel confident at this point, the faith in these people was not based off of connecting every prophecy with what was revealed. It was faith that someone could fix the situation they were in, whether they knew all the answers or not. And we are not done. Mark chapter 5, one of my favorite chapters in this entire book. Think of Jairus. Different gospels will have different readings in terms of when the death occurred. But when he comes to Jesus, and to his credit, he's a man of the synagogues. He knew something. But when it comes to raising the dead, how much faith would you have that after being told by your messenger, there's no point, there is no hope, she's dead? Think of how much faith you would need to have in this man that you potentially just met who says, no, she's not. Let's go back to your home. And walking this whole way, having faith that something can occur that you probably have never seen or heard of before. And then plopped right in the middle of that story, the bleeding woman. And we've talked, I think it was 12 years she's had this. What was this woman's mindset? If I can just touch his garment, the outside of the outer garment. How did she think Jesus' power worked based off of her thought process here? You never are, Sharon. No, I mean, I think, to Sharon's point, like, this woman's situation, she's been unclean, set apart from the religious ceremonies, the essentially practice of the day. She is a woman, like you said. She's ill. She has this thing that would spread uncleanness to anyone around her. Yet she had such faith in this power that she didn't even understand that she was going to find a way to get through this crowd. And in her mind, if I can just touch his shirt, right? Like, that is unreal. And I think part of why this stuck with me so much is when we read through or teach through the Gospels, I think the default way of thinking for me, whether it's in teacher mode or not, is everything is through the lens of Jesus and what he's doing, how he's acting, how he's behaving. And I think it's just so good to also focus on those who are putting themselves in the situations. Yes, ma'am. Oh, for sure. Yeah, the point is she knew, I don't think she knew how. I don't think she quite understood maybe even why. But, right, and where does that, think about her, think about the others. Where has their faith come from, right? They've not sat at his feet for a longer than it needed to sermon. Where has this faith come from? How has this been built? And think about everything we've been reading through Mark. How have they cultivated this faith? Other people's examples, they've heard it. This is just through essentially storytelling. This is something insane has happened. Let me tell you about it. I mean, it's only a couple chapters in where homes are being flooded by people so desperate to see this man. And so the faith of someone like this, who has not heard it broken down into a 5-point sermon of who he is and what he can do, she knows there's something about this person. And I have the faith to put myself in harm's way, essentially, just at the chance of being made better. There's another instance here where it's kind of just the group of the sick in the area as a whole who have the same kind of mindset, right? If they can just touch the fringe. And Jesus, I think it's important to note, let it happen, right? Think back to the woman who was bleeding, or even these folks when it says as many as touched it were made well. What did Jesus have to say about the faith of these people, even though they didn't possibly know everything they could? What gets quoted a lot? Your blank has made you well, right? Your faith. Jesus seemed okay with what they were bringing to the table. Maybe that's a really lame way to put it, but he seemed okay with what they were bringing, which was an incredible faith. And do you think if Jesus was to go around telling people the specifics of how to go about receiving healing, it would be, just touch my shirt, you've got what you need? No, obviously not. Yet their faith moved him to compassion and love. And so this incredible work is being done. The Syrophoenician woman, an incredible story of, even kind of pushing back against Jesus in this way of, she does have some level of understanding in who he is. Yet she presses him when he pushes back on the timing because she has such incredible faith, and it's all focused on what can be done for her child, this love and this faith that come through it. So, again, there's just more and more, and we don't have the time to cover them all. But we have these instances over and over and over again of these people who have incredible faith. And even, I love the father of the boy with the unclean spirit, because it's not even perfect faith, right? He says he believes and needs help with his unbelief. There's still room to grow there, but still the faith carried so much. And so, again, just these questions kind of for yourself here. When you think about the disciples, what did they know about Jesus when they left everything to follow him? The sick, the bleeding, the leper, the blind, what did they know about him when they sought him out? Yeah, I mean, maybe more than we give him credit, but not what we know. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. No, yeah, he offered something that no one else was offering. And when you think about these people, and we're going to talk about kind of their characteristics maybe that encourage this faith, but like they didn't have every answer. Their expectations on how he would work these miracles, I mean, think of the 2-part miracle of healing the blind, whether that's weird stuff in the other gospels about spitting in mud, right? Like not always what was expected, but the faith was there to follow through. No, you're doing great. Keep going.
But I guess a lot of times when we're the most helpless is when we have the strongest faith. And the issue that I think they didn't recognize, and I don't always recognize, is, yeah, when I physically can't do anything to help it, I have faith. But when I don't physically realize my spiritual condition, then I lose that faith. And that's where I think Jesus is trying to get them to transition from the physical into the spiritual and understand that they need him just as much in that.
Yeah, that is a perfect point. I mean, we are looking at a certain type of people who very clearly knew they needed something else that they couldn't provide. And we're going to look at these other groups in the book of Mark, and unfortunately, for two of them especially, it is the exact opposite. So, again, I think if you look through the encounters of Jesus, outside of just kind of the teaching to the disciples, almost every interaction is either this first group that we just covered or this second group. And that's people with knowledge that don't have the faith needed. So the religious leaders, what do we know about these men? Already been said. They are the ones with the knowledge, the access, the ability to read. Everything they need to know the Old Testament, God's Word, the Pentateuch, whatever, they have it. Yet, what do we learn from their response? When you see their response to Jesus, what can we assume maybe their views were when it came to faith and knowledge? Which of the two things to them took precedent? Yeah, and I think you see that in how they question him as well. Right? It is always, can we trip him up on the black and white of the book? Can we corner him with some riddle, with some interpretation, holding him to the traditions that we have created? We know everything. And what you're saying doesn't line up. And in their mind, the only way to handle that is, well, you must be wrong here. They couldn't even comprehend what was being taught. And so there was such a big disconnect there that it was almost like Jesus was fighting a losing battle with them from the very beginning. Because at no point did they come into it with a desire for a strengthened or increased faith. It was a desire to know, how was this right or how was this wrong? Which obviously was never the point. The second group, I think, is easy to skip over, but I think to some extent on a more human level, still works. When you look at Mark chapter 6, you see the encounter of Jesus and the people of Nazareth. And what do we know about Nazareth when it comes to Jesus and his life? Yeah, where he grew up, where his home was. These are the people that know him. And I know it's easy to think of Jesus' ministry as being his entire life, but approximately how long could Jesus have been here? Rough numbers are fine. 30 years or so? He didn't just show up, right, a 30-whatever-year-old stranger and say, all right, time to go now. We can't deny that he came in the flesh. So he was there. He lived on this earth with these people. And when he comes to Nazareth, he is with his people. So we would expect, I think, that they would listen and that they would believe. But instead, you read their reaction. It says they were astonished by his teaching. They realized his wisdom. They saw his mighty works. But what was the outcome? Do you remember how that interaction ended in Mark 6? Yeah, it was like the knowledge they did have negated anything else. They could only see him through the lens of what they knew, which was, I know his parents, I know his siblings. Isn't this the dude that fixes tables? Everything else is negated. Oh yeah, I mean, as a child, whatever it may be, this thing does not fit into the preconceived knowledge of him or notion of who he is. And so for that reason, even though they were astonished, even though they knew he had wisdom, even though they saw the miracles, this thing didn't fit. And then the final one, which I think is the one that for me hits home the most out of any, is the rich young ruler. what is said of the rich young ruler? How is he described, other than rich and young? What do we know about him?
He was a good servant up to that point. He was knowledgeable and wanted to know and do even more.
Absolutely. He knew what he needed to do. When essentially questioned on his obedience to the law, he had no issues. I have kept all of these things. And Jesus does not immediately push back with like, yeah, right, I know what you've done, right? We continue down the road, and then he gets asked to do something, and what is that? Right. And who have we seen do that exact same thing already in this book? Yeah, it's the same call of the disciples. And if you compare the disciples and their knowledge of Christ, which at that point, textually, I think at this point, they've acknowledged that he's the one that's prophesied. They believe they found the Messiah. That's kind of it, foundationally. Versus this guy, you would think, as we fly through this, that his response should be the same, that he would drop his nets, leave his family, and follow. Because he's dedicated his life to following these commands. He has the knowledge, but he doesn't have the faith to leave it all behind. And so these are the two groups that continue to be kind of brought to us in this book. And so again, there are so many in this book that had knowledge without faith. And I think the rich young ruler is such a great example of what I would say the good version of it, right? The guy whose heart was in the right place. Jesus looked at him and loved him. There was compassion. Yet at the end of the day, if he doesn't do what's asked of him, where does he stand? Big picture. Has he done enough? No. He has done wonderful things to earn the love and compassion. Earn is a bad word there, but like, you get it. He's the one that's done it the right way and is falling just short. And you can contrast that with the leaders of the day who seem to have no interest. I don't see Jay, but Jay, every time we brought him up, has just been like, they knew their answer, and I think he's right. Like, they knew where they were going the whole time. But still, the same problem arises. And knowledge alone, whether that's knowing every verse of the Old Testament or following every command that you can read, doesn't guarantee faith. And so when you look at the other group and you say, let's look at the group that did have faith, I think we can see a picture of what Mark wants us to become. We see incredible humility. We see people who are willing to live a hard life. And think back to what Lawrence was just talking with, right? Like a hard life. Not one of, glory and arrogance and pride, but like, this isn't the life that I think anyone would choose if they were looking to have the most enjoyable time here at times. And you see discipleship with not just leaving family and work, but following this man everywhere he goes with the goal of learning everything they can to take on his profession, essentially, when that time comes. And I think Jared hit on it, and I think others have too. This full surrender that we see from others, whether it is putting yourself in public shame just at the chance to be saved, or understanding that you can't do it on your own. And when I think about that group of people, I want to ask the question for us to really think about here, like, what personality traits or characteristics or way of life led these people to have such great faith, even without having every question answered? And we'll start with the disciples. I kind of just hit on it, right? They believed he was the one. And that alone was enough to step out of the boat and dedicate their lives. The next group, and the bleeding woman can fall in there. What about those people would lead them to having such great faith? How would you describe those people or their situations? Helpless. What else? Desperate pops in my mind. I'm sorry? Yeah, I mean, what could they have done? Without Jesus, what could they have done? Nothing. They would live out essentially their sentence, whether it's for their child or themselves, and that was their reality. And so they had so much faith because something had been brought before them that provided a hope that they had never seen before. And when you think about us in our situation, you think about the faith they had. And in Mark 11, getting close to Jesus kind of giving his final teachings in a lot of ways, he talks about this. He says, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt it in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done. Now, this is not a challenge for anyone to go try to throw a mountain in a sea to see if your faith's where it's at. But this is the mindset of this impossible thing is before me, and I have faith that because of the one who gives me the strength I need, it can happen. No matter if the entire world says it's impossible, it can be done. And so for a woman who's been diseased for 12 years or a man whose kid just died, they need that type of faith for anything to happen. And so, kind of to close, why do you think Mark would want this to be the message of his audience? This is probably the first gospel to make it out there. This is not too long after Jesus has died and risen. What do you think would be so powerful about this message for these brand new First Testament or New Testament Christians? What have they not had access to this entire time? The full story. They've never heard the full story. They have been stuck behind the paywall of the religious leaders, never quite getting it all. And so going into this new life, I think Mark wants them to know, you'll get there, but if you have this figured out, incredible things can happen. So again, that says 10:29. Someone's a little quick on the bell. This is the Ethan disclaimer so he doesn't get in trouble later. By no means am I saying that knowledge is not important or faith is not important. They are both important, and one should build upon the other, and both are mandatory. Clear. And then a couple questions just to think about for you guys. The whole kind of what struck me as I put this together. Ask these questions of yourself and genuinely give them some thought. Do I tend to rely solely on my own knowledge and understanding? Do I believe with a mountain-moving faith? Do I use my lack of knowledge as a crutch in my discipleship? And finally, do I prioritize perfect knowledge or perfect faith instead of finding the blend of both? Thank you all for letting me go over. So quick with the trigger to be done there. We are going to pick up with Sterling, rest of chapter 13. Thank you all.